Hello everyone, and welcome to another devlog for my top-down action space exploration game, Bottled Sky. This one is a couple of weeks late because I personally bit off a bit more than I could chew with my planned work for February. I wanted to spend the entirety of February prototyping some more music for the game, but I also wanted to have something finished to show off, which took longer than I expected. Just a warning for the rest of this video, I may use some music theory terminology, but I'll do my best to explain if I feel it's necessary. There has been new art and sound effects created by the team, but for this video I'm going to focus on the music side of things. So without further ado, let's face the music. The last time I made a video about music, I talked about the usefulness of building a motif library. In short, it's a collection of musical ideas. I prefer to keep each idea as a short melody, rhythm, or harmony, or some combination of the three. I generally keep these ideas as short as 1 to 16 bars. It can be longer, but the longer you make these ideas, the closer it becomes to just being a full song. You don't have to use notation software for this, by the way. If you have no idea how to read sheet music, you can use anything else that lets you write and save music. You'll see me use MuseScore for my motif library, but FL Studio for producing more polished audio. When you decide you want to write a full song, the point of the motif library is to draw inspiration from the ideas you've been collecting over time. It gives you a place to get started, which is often the hardest part about writing a song. You can use several of your motifs throughout your song, but obviously you don't have to keep using it if you feel like nothing in your collection fits what you're writing at the moment. Also, don't be shy about using the same motif across multiple songs in your soundtrack. If done so effectively, it can be a great storytelling tool. When I started in February, I wanted to add a few more ideas to my motif library. I usually start looking for new ideas by sitting at my piano, tinkering around, and writing anything remotely interesting into the motif library. You don't need to know how to play an instrument to write music, but it does help to come up with ideas. If you can't play an instrument, then you could try collecting references of existing music that sounds similar to what you want to make. Be careful though, because this might have the opposite effect where you feel like everything you come up with feels too similar to your references. I've only used the previous two methods to help with my writing, but there are more options. You could try a procedural music generation tool such as Midinus. I've not tried any myself, as I only heard about them after making my motif library, but if I feel stuck, this seems like a good idea. You could also try music generation AI. I haven't seen any AI that can consistently make interesting music, but we're not yet at the point where you could have an AI write an entire good soundtrack for you, but it does look good enough for, hopefully, copyright-free reference material to get inspiration from. After a quick session of improvising new motifs, I decided to write a short song as a warm-up. It didn't take long before I came up with this. Since this is clearly supposed to be a relaxing piece of music, my main objective here was to avoid any strong elements of tension or resolution. In music theory terms, I mostly use upper extensions for melodic accents, the major ninth in particular. When writing any resolution from one chord to another, keep the quality of either chord ambiguous or use a different root note to soften the resolution. For example, you could view this resolution as B major to E major, which would outline a perfect cadence, one of the stronger resolutions you could use. However, the B chord is missing at both its third and fifth notes, so it's unclear as to the exact quality, but I would call it a B9 based on overall context. Also, there is no actual E note in the E major chord, so it actually feels more like a G sharp minor chord, which would make it a much weaker resolution. Finally, the root note stays the same, which gives the feeling that the music isn't moving anywhere at all. Another example is at the very end, where I resolve an F sharp major chord to a B major chord. Again, this would normally be a strong perfect cadence, but I add additional notes that smooth out this transition. The F sharp major chord includes its major 7th, while the B major chord adds both its minor 7th and 11th, making this a B major 7 add 11 chord. Arguably, the strongest resolution in this piece would be here. If we ignore this B note on the bottom, then this is an E5 chord to an A major chord. The B note on the bottom does help a little bit to make this not feel like a strong resolution, but the biggest factor is actually the position of this harmonic movement in the context of this whole section. Because it's in the middle of this section, it feels less like a resolution and more like a beginning, for lack of a better word. This was initially supposed to be a warm-up that I might rework later, but I think I might end up using this whenever the player stops moving for a while. Kind of like those fun idle animations you see when you stop moving your character for a while. I might change the instrument away from being piano depending on how I end up writing the rest of the soundtrack, but other than that, I don't need to change much. So at this point, only a few days into February, I had my warm-up and a finished song, but still plenty of time to try something a little more ambitious. I wanted to write something that better reflected the action in the game. I looked through my Motif library for some ideas, and this particular one inspired me. The main thing to point out here is the unique 15/16 time signature. If you're not familiar with time signatures, let me explain. Most songs you hear are in a 4/4 time signature, and I really mean most, because I wouldn't be surprised if over 95% of all music stayed in 4/4 throughout the entire song. The best way to describe it, I think, is stable. It both feels natural to listen to and is easier to write for. Generally, this means you're listening to a groove where you can count from 1 to 4, with each count landing on a beat of music. After counting to 4, the beat repeats and you can count from 1 to 4 again. It's all about how you feel the beat of a song. That's not to say artists don't get creative with the timing and accents of their song's beat, but it's undeniably the most popular time signature. In a distant second, there are some other time signatures that you've likely heard, such as 2/4, 3/4, 6/8, 9/8, and 12/8. I'm not going to explain what all of those numbers mean, but just know that most music that doesn't fit into any of those time signatures is often described as stumbling, irregular, or erratic, which is exactly what I'm going for. The music I wanted to write was going to set the bar for how intense and dangerous the action can feel. In hindsight, maybe I went overboard with this idea, maybe not. I haven't decided yet, which is why I'm still considering this next piece to be a draft that I can shape up a bit more when I know exactly what I'm using it for. While writing this song, I did run into one major problem, which is that because I was constantly listening to a 15/16 rhythm, it started to feel more and more normalized to my ears instead of erratic, which made it difficult for me to continue writing. I had the idea to occasionally switch between 15/16 and 4/4 to shake things up a bit. This adds or takes away a quarter of a beat to each bar of music, which in theory should throw off the listener's rhythm, but in practice I think the transition was smoother than I expected. Oh well, I liked how it sounded, so for now that's all that matters. Okay, so I've picked my motif that will help me get started with writing the song. But contrary to popular belief, music is more than just rhythm, melody, and harmony. I consider instrumentation and sound design to be important factors to consider when writing a song. Instrumentation is a pretty simple concept. It's just, what music and sounds do I want in my song? Sound design is my umbrella term that encompasses concepts like instrument preparation that change the timbre of your instruments, such as how a trumpet sounds different when you cover the hole. It also covers the intricacies of creating electronic sounds, which is a huge topic that I'm still learning about myself. So how do I go about planning instrumentation and sound design? This is where references come in very handy. Just like my last video on writing music for this game, I'm going to show my references that I had in mind, and this time I'll be more specific about what I'm looking for in each reference. I want the beginning of the song to be calmer than the rest of the song, but also give a sense of foreboding, like a calm before the storm. After that, I want to drastically ramp up the density of sound to indicate that shit just got real. I used a lot of references, but here are a few of the best and most diverse examples of what I mean. One factor I'm considering is how long I want the calm bit to be. I've made the mistake before in a different project where I made a song intro too long, which causes some dissonance when the player is already in the heat of the action, but the music is still building up and doesn't reflect what the player is experiencing in gameplay. This is also what I'm mainly talking about when I say that this song is just a draft and may undergo some changes when I decide where I'll put it in the game. After the intro, as long as I bring in the intensity and keep it going for the entirety of the gameplay action, that's pretty much all you need to consider structure-wise. Except, you're not done yet. Sort of. You could just write one intense section of music and then put that on loop. And depending on your situation, this can even be a viable economical choice if you're short on time and need to crank out lots of music, particularly if that piece of music only shows up in a very small portion of the game. But hearing a short loop of music over and over on repeat can very easily bring down an experience. I'm not on a strict deadline though, and I'm of the opinion that a good soundtrack can transcend the game itself and become part of a wider culture. I've never played any Zelda games, but you can bet that I've listened to many songs across several Zelda titles. How many people will recognize at least one of these sounds and yet have not played the game it's from? Back to the point, I wanted a few different sections that vary a little in style and intensity, but still remain cohesive so that it doesn't become stale after listening to it on loop. At a minimum, you can look at many classic examples of video game loops and see that they follow a simple A to B looping structure. Even just having two different sections on loop between each other is a huge step towards keeping the listener from getting tired. It gets the job done, but I wanted more. So not including the introduction, I created 4 or so distinct sections of music. I'll get to playing the entire song soon, but I first wanted to show my references for these sections. I also needed to learn from the past pieces of music I've created because I hadn't yet settled on a particular style for the whole soundtrack. The first track I wrote a couple of years ago sounded like this. When writing my second piece, I tried just going with orchestral sounds only, but after thinking about it for a while, I decided that a more even mix of real and synth sounds was the direction I wanted to take the rest of the soundtrack in. During this period of indecision, I looked for inspiration that I thought would be a good fit stylistically for this game. One style I liked was this sort of melodic speed trance by one of my longtime favorite artists, Dimrain47. I've known about them ever since Newgrounds was still a big deal, because I was also writing music and posting it to Newgrounds even back then. I did try looking for more similar references from other artists to get a broader understanding of the style, but didn't find much. There's plenty of fast trance music, but it's the speedy melodic style that I'm interested in, and not so much the trance. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but I did discover this great reference by Team Grimoire. For my final section, I didn't so much as have a single specific reference, I just thought that organ shredding was a cool fit for an intense battle theme. Now that I'm done beating around the proverbial bush, you can finally listen to this piece of music that's taken me well over a month to write. Overall, I wish I could have spent more time on this to make it even better, but at some point you just need to tie up the loose ends and move on so you can make progress elsewhere. I think my biggest tip for anyone that feels stuck writing music for their game is that, like any other asset, you can always come back and iterate on it over time. You don't need to get it right the first try. You'd think that would be obvious, but we don't live in a world where artists release patches for their songs. We tend to think of music as something that is permanent once it's made, but there really is nothing stopping you from just making bad music to start with and coming back later to fix it. You might find that it's not as bad as you thought, or maybe having some time off and diverting your attention elsewhere ends up giving you some ideas to try when you come back to it. I didn't do that with this song, because despite it taking so long to write, I was actually making progress each day that I worked on it. Just to prove that I do take my own advice, the very first song that I wrote for this game is still incomplete. Since I've taken my attention away from it, I do now have some ideas for what I could change and add to it, so you might see a video in future where I revisit it because it still has good ideas. Anyway, if you're also very into video game music like I am and have tips you want to share with others, I'd love to read about them in the comments or in the Bottled Sky community Discord server, linked in the description. If you have any questions about my music writing process, I'd also love to hear those. Like the video if you enjoyed watching, subscribe if you want to be notified about future videos. Thanks for watching, that's all for now, and I'll see you later.